It started, as these things often do, with a need for quiet. My thesis, a sprawling beast on obscure archival practices and their psychological impact, ironic, I know, demanded absolute focus, something my shared student apartment couldn't offer. The university library was too sterile, too public. I needed isolation, a place where the only sounds were the rustling of pages and the frantic tapping of my own keyboard. That's how I found Crooked Gable, tucked away deep in the Appalachians, surrounding Boone, miles up a winding, poorly maintained dirt road that seemed determined to shake my old sedan apart. The listing was vague, almost an afterthought on a cluttered local bulletin board online, promising only seclusion and character. The rent was laughably low, the kind of price that usually means leaky roofs, no plumbing, or neighbors who cook meth. Still, the photos, grainy as they were, showed a certain dilapidated charm, an old two-story farmhouse swallowed by trees. The drive up confirmed the seclusion. The dirt road narrowed, trees pressing in on either side, their branches interlocking overhead, creating a perpetual twilight, even during the day. My phone lost signal bars one by one until it was just a useless brick in my pocket. It felt like driving into another time, or maybe just off the edge of the map entirely. When I finally reached the clearing, the house stood there, looking less like the photos and more like something drawn from a half-forgotten nightmare. Crooked Gable was an apt name. Nothing about it seemed quite right. The roofline sagged unevenly, windows were set at slightly off-kilter angles, and the whole structure leaned subtly to one side, as if perpetually bracing against a wind that wasn't blowing. It wasn't just old, it felt wrong. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, pine needles, and something else underneath. A faint, almost electric tang, like the air after a close lightning strike. Ozone, maybe? I dismissed it as mountain air, different from the city smog I was used to. I parked on the patch of gravel that served as a driveway and walked towards the house. The silence was profound, broken only by the caw of a distant crow and the crunch of my own feet. There was a stillness here that felt less peaceful and more like waiting. Around the side, almost hidden by overgrown rhododendrons, was the root cellar entrance. Heavy, slanted wooden doors secured with a thick, ancient-looking padlock crusted with rust. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, yet that strange ozone smell seemed stronger here, mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay. I shivered, despite the mild autumn air. It was just a cellar, I told myself. Every old farmhouse had one. Nothing to get worked up about. My landlord, Casimir Thorne, arrived precisely on time, driving a surprisingly pristine, though older, sedan that seemed out of place on the rough road. He was a tall, thin man dressed in a suit that was perhaps a size too large, his movements precise and formal. He didn't offer a handshake, just a curt nod. His eyes, pale and watery, seemed to look past me rather than at me. The tour was perfunctory. He pointed out the basics. The kitchen with its surprisingly functional, if ancient, appliances, the living room dominated by a massive stone fireplace, the two sparsely furnished bedrooms upstairs. He seemed reluctant to linger, his explanations brief. He particularly skirted around the downstairs bathroom, merely gesturing towards the door. I peeked inside later. It was a horror show of peeling pink tile and a ghastly avocado green bathtub. An unsettling coldness emanated from that room, distinct from the rest of the house. Thorne also didn't mention the root cellar, and when I pointed towards it, he simply waved a dismissive hand and said, "Storage, landlord's use only." The finality in his tone discouraged further questions. The rental agreement was a single, Yellowed page, the terms stark. 1 full year, no exceptions. Rent due cash on the 1st of the month. Dropped in a specific mailbox down by the main highway. No pets, no loud parties, standard stuff. But the 1-year commitment for such a remote, rundown place felt odd. Thorne barely glanced as I signed, pocketed the first month's cash without counting it, handed me a single heavy brass key, and was back in his car almost before I could say thank you. The speed of his departure left me feeling vaguely uneasy. It took a few days before I encountered the neighbors. Down the dirt road, maybe a quarter mile, was the only other dwelling. A small, weathered cabin, almost identical in its unsettling stillness to Crooked Gable, though perhaps less architecturally disturbed. An elderly couple, Ilara and Silas Croft, lived there. Ilara, small and bird-like with unnervingly bright eyes, flagged me down as I drove past one afternoon. She chattered amiably enough about the weather and the deer, but her gaze was sharp, assessing. Silas stood silently on their porch, leaning against a post, whittling a piece of wood with a large knife, his eyes never leaving me. He didn't speak or even nod. Ilara mentioned Thorne rarely came up the mountain, only collecting rent. She asked if I was settling in okay at the old Gable place. There was a slight hesitation before she said the name, a flicker in her eyes. I couldn't quite decipher. She warned me about bears and told me Silas kept mostly to himself since the change. She didn't elaborate. Their property, like mine, was surrounded by dense woods, marked by a surprisingly well-maintained, if simple, wooden fence. The contrast between the cared-for fence and the dilapidated cabin was jarring. Those first few weeks, however, were mostly defined by the silence I'd craved. I threw myself into my research, setting up my workspace in the larger upstairs bedroom overlooking the woods. The house creaked and groaned, as old houses do. I occasionally felt cold spots, particularly near the downstairs bathroom and the locked root cellar door, but I chalked it up to drafts in an old building. The unsettling architecture, the slightly tilted floors, and oddly angled walls became just part of the background noise. I was making progress on my thesis. The isolation was working, I told myself, ignoring the persistent, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface. The smell from the cellar, though, that faint tang of ozone, and damp earth never quite went away. The quiet began to wear on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just peaceful. It was absolute. A heavy blanket smothering all other sound. Nights were the worst. The utter blackness outside the windows, the creaks and groans of the old house amplifying in the stillness. It started to feel less like solitude and more like being entombed. My curiosity about the locked root cellar, initially dismissed, began to fester. Why lock it from the outside? What storage could Thorne possibly need in such a remote, inaccessible place? The persistent, peculiar smell emanating from beneath. The heavy wooden doors became a constant nagging question mark in my mind. I tried Thorne's number, the one listed on the rental agreement, several times, planning to ask about the cellar, but it always went straight to a generic voicemail that sounded like it hadn't been checked in years. My unease grew. Was it just old junk? Forgotten belongings of previous tenants? Or something else? The landlord's use-only explanation felt flimsy, evasive. The image of the thick, rusted padlock became an obsession. What was it protecting? Or a more chilling thought began to surface. What was it keeping in? After a particularly restless night, where every creak of the house sounded like a footstep, and the wind seemed to whisper unintelligible words against the glass, I decided I couldn't stand it anymore. The not knowing was worse than whatever might be down there. rationalizing that maybe there was old wiring or plumbing I needed to be aware of, or perhaps just needing to satisfy the gnawing curiosity that was derailing my thesis work. I went. Outside, armed with a heavy rock I found near the woodpile and the tire iron from my car's trunk. The padlock was even more formidable up close. Thick, pitted iron, stained deep orange with rust that seemed almost organic. It resisted my initial attempts with the tire iron, the metal groaning in protest, but holding fast. Frustration mounted, mixing with a growing sense of dread. Why was this so difficult? It felt unnaturally stubborn. Finally, putting all my weight. Behind the tire iron wedged into the shackle and striking the lock body sharply with the rock, I heard a satisfying, albeit loud, crack. The rusted metal shackle snapped. The heavy wooden doors groaned open a few inches on protesting hinges. I hesitated, the smell washing over me, much stronger now. Damp earth, the sharp tang of ozone, but also something else, something cloying and faintly metallic, like old blood or rust. It wasn't pleasant. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the heavy doors fully open. Steep, rough-hewn stone steps led down into darkness. There was no light switch apparent. Using the flashlight app on my still signal-less phone, I cautiously descended. The air grew colder with each step, the smell intensifying. The cellar was small, the floor packed earth, the walls rough stone and dirt. It was mostly empty, save for some rotting wooden shelves clinging precariously to one wall and scattered debris, broken pottery shards, rusted metal bits. But then my light fell upon the walls. Scratched crudely into the packed earth, likely with a sharp stone or fingernail, were dozens of drawings. They looked like a child's work, but profoundly disturbing. Stick figures, angular and distorted, were depicted trapped inside roughly drawn squares or boxes. Their faces were simple circles, but the mouths were jagged, open in silent screams, the eyes wide, empty dots conveying sheer terror. Some figures seemed to be clawing at the edges of their prisons. Beneath one cluster of these trapped figures, almost hidden in the dirt near the base of the wall, was something else. I knelt, brushing away loose soil. It was a small, tarnished, silver locket, shaped like a heart, snapped in half. One side was empty, just a hollow indentation. The other held the faded, water-damaged corner of a tiny photograph, impossible to make out any features. The metallic smell was strongest here. A cold dread, far beyond simple unease, washed over me. This wasn't just storage. This wasn't just an old cellar. The drawings, the broken locket, the smell, something terrible had happened down here. I backed slowly up the steps, pulling the heavy doors shut, my hands trembling. I didn't bother trying to fix the broken lock. I suddenly wished desperately that I had never opened that door. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt thick with presence. The days following my trespass into the root cellar marked a distinct shift. The subtle unease that had haunted the edges of my stay at Crooked Gable solidified into a palpable sense of dread. The house itself seemed to awaken. The whispers I'd occasionally dismissed as wind became more frequent, indistinct murmurs seeming to emanate from the very walls, especially at night. Sometimes, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear what sounded frustratingly like a name being spoken, always too quiet to be sure, always seeming to come from just outside my bedroom door. Then came the scratching. It started faintly, like mice skittering behind the plaster, but it localized quickly to the cellar door I had forced open. Not the outer doors, but the interior door at the top of the stone steps inside the house, a door I hadn't even noticed before, hidden behind. A curtain of cobwebs in a dark corner of the kitchen. It was a frantic, persistent sound, like fingernails dragging across old wood, usually starting just after midnight and continuing intermittently until dawn. I tried barricading it with a kitchen chair, but sometimes I'd find the chair shifted, slightly in the morning, the door ajar. The phantom footsteps became bolder, no longer just creaks, but distinct, heavy treads pacing the floor above me when I was downstairs, or light, quick steps scurrying across the floorboards below when I was upstairs trying to work. Once, I heard what sounded unmistakably like a child giggling, a high-pitched, chilling sound that cut through the oppressive silence and sent ice down my spine. I'd call out, heart pounding, but only silence would answer. The shadows in the corners of my eyes grew more defined, sometimes resolving into a tall, unnaturally thin silhouette just vanishing around a doorframe or outside a window as I turned my head. Objects began to move more noticeably. Not just keys, but the heavy archival books I'd leave stacked neatly on my desk would be slightly askew in the morning. A kitchen knife left on the drying rack might be found resting on the counter instead. The rocking chair in the living room, which I never used, would sometimes be facing a slightly different direction than when I went to bed. It was insidious, designed to make me question my own memory, my own sanity. The flickering lights also took on a disturbing pattern. 3 short flashes, a pause, 3 short flashes. Morse code for S? It felt deliberate, mocking. The strange ozone and metallic smell intensified, particularly strong near the cellar entrance in the kitchen. It would sometimes waft through the house without warning, thick and nauseating, making my eyes water. And the cellar door itself, the one leading down from the kitchen, was the worst. Despite my efforts to keep it shut, wedging the chair firmly against it each night, I found it slightly open at least 3 mornings a week, a sliver of cold, damp, foul-smelling air escaping from the darkness below. The figure at the edge of the woods became a more regular fixture, tall, impossibly thin, dark against the trees. Sometimes I thought I could almost make out features, but it always dissolved back into shadow the moment I tried to focus. Its presence felt watchful, patient, and deeply malevolent. Around the same time, the strange arrangements started appearing. Small piles of smooth river stones stacked impossibly high on the porch steps. Intricate patterns of twigs laid out on the path to the door, circles of dried leaves placed carefully beneath my bedroom window. They felt like markers, or warnings, or perhaps offerings. Lara Croft's visits became more frequent and more unsettling. She brought over the promised stew one afternoon. It smelled vaguely of iron and herbs I didn't recognize. I thanked her profusely and dumped it in the woods later. It was during this visit she gave me the mirror. Small, oval, the glass clouded and distorted with age, set in a tarnished silver frame. "Hang this on the cellar door, dearie," she'd instructed, her bright eyes fixed on mine. "Inside the house, mind you, facing in. Reflects back what tries to get out. Keeps things settled." The way she said "settled" sent another shiver down my spine. I did as she asked, feeling foolish, hanging the clouded mirror on the inside of the kitchen cellar door. It didn't stop the scratching or the door being found ajar. Silas remained a silent sentinel. I'd catch glimpses of him standing at the edge of his property, near the fence line, sometimes just staring towards Crooked Gable, sometimes whittling, always unnervingly still. He never waved, never acknowledged me, just watched. His silent observation was almost more unnerving than Ilara's cryptic pronouncements. My research became frantic, fueled by caffeine and a growing terror. I spent hours in the university archives, digging through microfiche, old county records, anything related to the property. That's when I found it. a poorly indexed box of coroner's inquests and police reports from the 1950s. The Davies family, William and Mary Davies, and their two young children, Caleb and Sarah. Officially listed as a missing persons case, closed due to lack of leads after a year. But the unofficial notes, the interviews with neighbors, including a much younger but still identifiable Alara and Silas Croft, painted a darker picture. Whispers of William Davies becoming obsessed with local folklore, of strange symbols, appearing around the property, of the children being kept confined for misbehavior. The reports mentioned the root cellar specifically, noting the heavy padlock and the difficulty investigators had opening it, only to find it empty except for disturbing childlike markings on the walls and a broken locket. The symbols described matched the horrifying figures I'd seen scratched into the dirt. The cumulative effect was devastating. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. My thesis was a mess. I was jumpy, irritable, losing weight. The house felt actively hostile now, the cold spots colder, the whispers louder, the scratching more frantic. I started sleeping exclusively on the living room sofa, lights blazing, the television tuned to anything loud and distracting, though my morbid curiosity often led me back to true crime shows, searching for answers I simultaneously dreaded. Finding, I took to urinating off the back porch, the thought of using either bathroom, especially the green and pink monstrosity downstairs, filling me with a primal revulsion. I knew I needed to leave, but the 1-year lease, my depleted savings, and the sheer distance from any semblance of normalcy kept me trapped. The feeling of being watched was constant, inescapable. The breaking point came late one night, fueled by stale coffee and the gnawing dread that had become my constant companion. I was hunched over my laptop, scrolling through obscure online forums dedicated to Appalachian folklore and unsolved mysteries, desperately searching for any mention of the Davies family or Crooked Gable. That's when I found it. A post from years ago on a defunct GeoCities-esque site, written by someone claiming to be a distant relative of a former Boone deputy. It recounted the unofficial theory, the one whispered but never printed. William Davies, driven mad by isolation and belief in dark local legends, had ritually sacrificed his family, locking the children, Caleb and Sarah, in the root cellar as part of the process before vanishing himself. The post even included a hand-drawn approximation of the symbols found. Crude boxes containing panicked stick figures, horrifyingly similar to the drawings beneath my feet. The moment I processed the words, the connection snapping into place with sickening clarity, the house erupted. It wasn't a creak or a whisper this time. It was an explosion of sound and cold. A deafening bang, bang, bang came from inside the cellar, right below the kitchen floor where I sat, as if something heavy was being thrown against the stone walls. Simultaneously, high-pitched, echoing laughter, unmistakably children's laughter, but warped and cruel, filled the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Doors throughout the house slammed shut with violent force. One after another, like a chain reaction of malevolent energy. An intense, unnatural cold permeated the room, raising goosebumps on my skin and making my breath plume in front of me. Then I saw it. Pressed against the glass of the large kitchen, window overlooking the dark yard, was the figure, no longer a peripheral shadow, but starkly present. Impossibly tall and thin, pitch black, with limbs bent at unnatural angles. I couldn't see a face, just a deeper void where a face should be. But I felt it looking directly at me. Raw terror, pure and undiluted, seized me. I scrambled for my phone, fumbling it, dropping it. When I snatched it up, the screen was blank, Dead. No signal. Nothing. Panic clawed at my throat. My keys. I needed my keys. I frantically patted my pockets, then scanned the countertop where I always left them in the small ceramic dish. Empty. My blood ran cold. Then my foot struck something on the floor near the sofa. My keychain. Sitting there innocently, as if placed deliberately. No time to question it. I grabbed them and lunged for the back door, fumbling with the locks, my fingers numb with cold and fear. Outside, the cold air hit me, but the sounds from the house, the banging, the laughter, continued. I sprinted to my car, the gravel crunching loudly underfoot. I jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it frantically. The engine sputtered, whined, caught for a second, then died. No, no, no. I tried again. Sputter. Whine. Silence. My eyes darted to the house. Standing silhouetted against the faint light filtering from inside, framed perfectly in the small, grimy, barred window of the root cellar's exterior doors, was the tall, thin figure. Just standing there, watching. A third turn of the key, accompanied by a desperate prayer, and the engine roared to life, coughing and sputtering but running. I slammed the gear stick into reverse, tires spinning uselessly on the icy gravel patch for a heart-stopping moment before catching. I fishtailed wildly, correcting, then stomped on the gas, heading down the treacherous dirt road as fast as I dared. The banging and laughter from the house faded behind me, replaced by the roar of my engine and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Then, in my driver's side mirror, I saw movement. Not behind me, but beside me. Keeping pace with the car, darting with impossible speed between the thick, dark trunks of the trees lining the road, was the figure, a black streak against the deeper black of the woods, its thin limbs pumping rhythmically, effortlessly matching my speed. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I screamed, flooring the accelerator, fishtailing dangerously close to the ditch. The eye-breather moment. My tires hit the comparative safety of the paved road at the end of the dirt track. I risked a glance back in the mirror. The figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. The woods were just woods again, dark and silent under the moonlight. I didn't slow down. I drove like a man possessed, not stopping until I reached the fluorescent-lit safety of a 24-hour gas station miles down the highway. Shaking uncontrollably, I called my uncle, the only relative who lived within a few hours, and the only one who entertained my interest in the morbid and unexplained without judgment. I didn't drive to his place. I made him come get me, abandoning my car at the gas station for the time being. I couldn't face being alone, couldn't face the dark roads by myself. When he arrived, I spilled out the entire story, the words tumbling over each other in my haste. The true crime show, the cellar, the figure, the chase. He listened patiently, his usual skepticism tempered by the sheer terror evident in my voice and appearance. He was the one who found the final piece, online later that day, confirming the local legend I'd stumbled upon. The Boone archives, digitized and obscure, contained the follow-up. The Genro suspect, Silas Croft's brother-in-law, had indeed been found dead weeks after the Davies family disappearance. He had shot himself in the head while sitting in his light-colored pickup truck with the wood paneling, parked just off the dirt road, almost exactly where I'd seen the truck parked on those unsettling nights, right beside the fence line of Crooked Gable. The case remained officially unsolved. Months passed. Winter thawed into a reluctant spring. I'd dropped out, forfeiting the exorbitant year's rent Casimir Thorne undoubtedly continued to collect. The thesis remained unfinished, a monument to my failed attempt at academic solitude. But essential documents, irreplaceable research notes, and a few sentimental items were still back at Crooked Gable. I couldn't face going back alone. I managed to convince a sturdy, rational friend, armed with skepticism and a tire iron, just in case, to accompany me during broad daylight. The drive up the dirt road was tense, every shadow seeming deeper, every tree seeming to watch. The house looked even more dilapidated in the harsh sunlight, the crookedness more pronounced. The air still held that faint, unsettling tang. We approached cautiously. The front door was unlocked, swinging open slightly in the breeze. Inside, the house was cold, silent. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams slanting through the grimy windows. In the kitchen, the aftermath of the burst pipe was evident, a warped patch on the floorboards, a lingering damp smell mingling with the ever-present cellar odor. The cellar door itself, the one leading down from the kitchen, stood wide open, revealing only blackness. The cracked mirror Ilara had given me lay shattered on the floor beneath it. We didn't go near it. We gathered my belongings in record time, my friend occasionally muttering about bad wiring and old house smells, me just wanting to leave. As we pulled away, heading back down the dirt road, we passed the Crofts' cabin. Ilara was in her front garden, kneeling, tending to overgrown rose bushes with a pair of rusty shears. She looked up as we approached, her face impassive. Impulsively, needing some kind of closure, some acknowledgement of the horror, I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "Mrs. Croft," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "The Davies family. The ones who lived up there before me. Do you know what happened to them?" Ilara stopped her work. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her apron. She turned to face me, walking deliberately towards the fence line, the rusty shears still clutched in her hand. Her bright eyes, colder than I remembered, fixed on mine. A long moment of silence stretched between us, filled only by the buzzing of insects and the distant caw of a crow. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her thin lips. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dry whisper, barely carrying on the breeze, yet piercing me to the core. "The Davies? Ah, yes, that old story." She paused, glancing back towards Crooked Gable for a fraction of a second before her gaze snapped back to mine, the smile widening just slightly, devoid of any warmth. "We thought you knew." She turned back to her roses, snipping a dead bloom with a decisive click of the shears, perhaps humming a tune too low for me to hear. My friend swore, under his breath beside me. We didn't need any further invitation to leave. We drove away, leaving Crooked Gable and the watchful silence of the mountains behind, but knowing, deep down, that a part of me would remain trapped there forever, in the cold darkness of that root cellar, wondering what, exactly, they thought I knew.